It was a quiet evening when I walked up the narrow street toward my sister's house. The lamps along the road hummed faintly, spilling their pale orange light onto cracked pavement. I had visited her countless times before, but that night something about the air felt weighted, as though the very walls of the neighborhood carried a secret they were unwilling to share. Her window glowed softly, and I could hear faint laughter floating out into the street. But it wasn't the laughter I knew. My sister had always laughed with her whole body, shoulders trembling, eyes glistening, voice sharp and alive. What I heard that night was hollow, a practiced echo, like an actress who had forgotten her lines but forced the sound anyway. When she opened the door, I studied her face. She smiled, but her eyes darted away from mine. She smelled faintly of cinnamon, the same cologne our mother used to press into her scarves. For a moment, that scent carried me back years. But then it dissolved, and I was pulled back into the strange tension lingering in her doorway. "Come in," she said. The dining table was already set. She had cooked lentils, rice, and a simple curry, the kind of meal we'd shared 100 times. But the atmosphere was different. Even the chairs looked tired, their wooden backs sagging as if they had absorbed too much silence. We ate in fragments of conversation. She asked about my work, about old friends, about the weather, anything but herself. The clatter of her spoon against the plate seemed louder than her words. I watched her hands as she reached for the water jug, and that's when I noticed. Her wrists were bare. For years my sister had worn our mother's bangles, thin gold circles etched with delicate flowers. They weren't just ornaments. They were reminders of who we were, of where we came from. She wore them at the wedding, at family gatherings, even and cooking, their light catching the fire from the stove. They had always been there, quiet but constant. But now, nothing. At first I thought perhaps she had stored them away for safety. Yet something in the way her fingers curled inward, almost protective, told me otherwise. "Where are the bangles?" I asked quietly, almost as if I didn't want the walls to hear. Her spoon froze mid-air. She lowered it gently, avoiding my eyes. For a long time she said nothing. The air between us thickened. I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each second heavier than the last. Finally she whispered, "Gone." I leaned forward. "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" Her voice cracked when she spoke again. "Armin, he lost them. In a game." The words sliced through me. At first, I didn't even understand them. A game? My mind refused to form the picture. I stared at her bare wrists, trying to imagine Armin's hands pushing those bangles across a table like poker chips. The thought was grotesque, obscene. I pushed my plate away. "He gambled them?" My voice was low, dangerous. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Not just the bangles, all of it. The necklace, the earrings, everything Mother gave me. It felt like a gut punch, sharp and merciless. I remembered my mother polishing that jewelry on quiet afternoons, the way she had lifted each piece with reverence, as if it carried the weight of our ancestors. She had handed it to my sister on her wedding day, her eyes glistening with pride. That jewelry wasn't gold. It was blood. It was memory. And now it was gone. Not stolen by strangers, not lost in some accident, but thrown away by the very man who had sworn to protect her. I tried to breathe, but my chest felt caged. Rage and sorrow collided inside me, fighting for space. My hands trembled under the table. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. She wiped her eyes quietly, as if embarrassed by her own tears. "Because this isn't the first time. And I was ashamed." Her words chilled me. Not the first time. that hollow laughter at the door, the way her smile faltered. Suddenly it all made sense. This betrayal had been unfolding in silence, brick by brick, until the whole foundation had cracked. I stood up, unable to sit still. The walls of the dining room felt too close, pressing in on me. My eyes fell on the cabinet in the corner, the one where she usually kept her jewelry box. I walked to it, opened the drawer, and there it was. The box itself, velvet and soft, glowing faintly under the lamp. I lifted it. The weight was wrong, too light. I opened it slowly, almost fearing what I already knew. Empty. The velvet interior shone like an accusation. The spaces where the bangles and necklace once rested, now hollow outlines, like ghosts. I stared at it for what felt like hours. That empty box was more than a container. It was a tombstone. It carried not just the loss of jewelry, but the collapse of trust, the death of dignity. Behind me, my sister whispered, "I'm sorry." I closed the lid gently, my hands trembling. "Don't apologize. This isn't your sin." But inside me, something dark had begun to stir. A dangerous, protective rage. A voice that whispered, "He has gutted her trust, and he will answer for it." I placed the box back in the drawer and turned to her. She was still standing by the table, her shoulders small, her eyes haunted. In that moment, I knew this story wasn't just about jewelry. It was about something much deeper. And I also knew, with a certainty that frightened me, that this was only the beginning. When I left my sister's house that night, the image of the empty velvet box followed me like a ghost. I walked home with heavy steps, but my mind wandered backward, into years long past, as if memory itself wanted to remind me how much weight those jewels had carried, and how far we had fallen from the promise they once symbolized. I remember the Phais. First time I saw our mother lay them out on the bed. It was during a hot summer afternoon. The ceiling fans squeaked above us, and the curtains swayed lazily in the warm breeze. She had unwrapped each piece carefully from soft cotton cloth, her hands almost trembling as though she was holding living things. The bangles, the necklace, the earrings, all glittering with that quiet, deep glow of old gold. "These aren't just ornaments," she said, polishing one of the bangles with the edge of her sari. "They are shields. They protect a woman's dignity when the world tries to strip it from her." I was young then, barely in my teens, but her words stayed with me. I didn't fully understand them, yet I saw the way she looked at my sister as she spoke, a gaze heavy with both love and warning. Years later, on my sister's wedding day, those same jewels gleamed against her skin. I still remember the sight of her standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the necklace, her face glowing with excitement and nerves. She looked radiant, yes, but also weighed down, as if she knew she was carrying more than just gold. She was carrying the memory of our mother, the honor of our family, the silent promises of generations before us. I stood in the corner of the room, watching her. My sister caught my reflection in the mirror and laughed nervously. "Do I look like Mother?" she asked. I swallowed hard. "More than you know." That day, I felt proud and protective. I promised myself silently that I would always be her shield, even if she had another man to play that role now. And that man, Armin. When I first met him, I wanted to believe he was good. He had the kind of smile that could make people forget their doubts, and a confidence that filled every room he entered. He spoke of business plans, of opportunities abroad, of a future filled with possibilities. My sister's eyes sparkled. "Wursto, Daus." Hen he talked. She looked at him as though he were already building a palace for her. But even in those early days, there were cracks in the illusion. I remember one afternoon, months before the wedding, when he came to our house for tea. He leaned back casually in his chair, talking about a card game he had played with friends the night before. "I nearly lost my watch," he joked, laughing. "But that's the thrill of it, isn't it? Risk is what makes life worth living." My mother stiffened slightly, though she said nothing. I caught it, the way her hands gripped the edge of her sari tighter, the way her eyes darted to the jewelry box resting in her cabinet. Later, when I walked him out, I asked directly, "Do you gamble often?" He laughed, clapping me on the shoulder. "Just for fun. Don't worry, brother. I know where to draw the line." But even then, something unsettled me. Risk wasn't a game when it involved people you loved. Still, my sister's happiness silenced my doubts. She defended him every time he was late, every time he joked too easily about money. "He's just ambitious," she'd say. "He wants to give me the world." And I wanted to believe her, because I wanted to believe she had chosen right. But after the wedding, the signs grew harder to ignore. I'd visit their home, and sometimes I'd notice her eyes were tired, rimmed with red as though she had been crying. I'd ask, and she'd smile faintly, brushing it off with, "I didn't sleep well." Other times I'd see him come in late, his shirt smelling faintly of cigarettes and whiskey. He'd kiss her cheek casually, too casually, and disappear into their room. She'd pretend not to notice, setting dinner quietly on the table. One evening, when I came over unexpectedly, I saw her hurriedly slip her wedding ring back on, as though she had been hiding it. I never asked why. I wish I had. The memories play now like a slow-moving film reel, every detail sharper in hindsight. His jokes about risk, her practiced smiles, my silence. Family members had warned us Ooh. At gatherings, uncles would whisper, "He's too reckless." A cousin once told me she saw him at a gambling den, laughing with men who reeked of desperation. But when I asked him about it, he only smirked. People love to talk when they're jealous. And I let it go. Because confronting him would have meant confronting my sister's choice, her happiness, her entire dream of a life she had built around him. I convinced myself she was strong, that she would tell me if something was truly wrong. I convinced myself that love meant patience, that trust meant silence. Now, with the jewelry gone, every ignored red flag sharpened into knives of guilt. That empty velvet box wasn't just Armand's betrayal. It was also my failure. I had promised to be her shield, and instead I had stood by, hands folded, while her dignity was bartered away piece by piece. Sometimes, at night, I still see my sister on her wedding day. The way the gold necklace caught the light, the way her eyes shimmered with hope, the way our mother whispered in her ear before sending her off, "Guard this, for it carries more than gold." If only I had listened more closely. If only I had trusted my instincts instead of Armand's charm. Now every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty spaces in that jewelry box, hollow impressions of bangles and necklaces, like outlines of everything I should have protected, but didn't. And in those outlines, I saw my sister's fading smile. It was a stormy night when everything collapsed. The sky had been restless all day, swollen with clouds that pressed low against the rooftops. By evening, the rain began, not gentle but fierce, slashing against windows as though the heavens themselves were furious. I remember thinking storms had a way of dragging secrets out of hiding, and that night I was right. I went to my sister's house without calling first. Something in my chest urged me forward, a gnawing unease I couldn't quiet. By the time I reached her doorstep, my coat was drenched, and the sound of thunder rolled like drums of war in the distance. When she opened the door, I saw it instantly. Her face, pale and hollow, her eyes swollen from crying. Behind her, the dining table was set for two, but only one chair was occupied. The other, his chair, was empty. I stepped inside slowly. "Where is he?" She shook her head, almost mechanically. "Gone." The single word hit harder than I expected. She sat at the table again, shoulders slumped, staring at the plate of untouched food in front of her. The curry had grown cold, the rice stiff. I closed the door behind me and sat across from her, at the empty chair's side, my hand brushing against its wooden edge. It was strange how the absence of one man could fill a room so completely. I waited, letting the rain speak for us. Finally, she broke the silence. "He's not coming back tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. Maybe not at all." Her voice was flat, but her fingers trembled as she folded and unfolded the edge of her napkin. I swallowed hard. "Tell me everything." And she did. Her words came in fragments at first, then in a rush, like floodwaters tearing through a dam. She told me about the gambling, how it had started small, nights out with friends, excuses she believed at first. Then the lies multiplied, debts hidden under rugs, bills paid late, sudden disappearances followed by cheap explanations. She confessed that she had pawned small items quietly, trying to cover for him. A bracelet, a ring, a watch he had already borrowed money against, until there was nothing left to give except the heirlooms. "I thought if I helped him just once more he'd stop," she said, her voice breaking. "But it was never enough. He always needed more." Tears slid down her cheeks as she looked at me. "Do you know what it feels like? To hand over your mother's necklace to a stranger behind a counter? To sign the paper that says you've given away the last thing that tethered you to her? And to do it while your husband stands behind you, whispering that he'll fix everything soon?" Her voice cracked on the last word. I couldn't answer. My throat burned as though I had swallowed fire. I saw her sitting there, stripped of everything our mother had entrusted to her, and I realized this was more than theft. This was desecration. My mind painted cruel metaphors I couldn't escape. Arman wasn't a husband. He was a parasite, a hollow man feeding off her devotion. Their home, once a temple of trust, had been turned into a gambling table where her dignity was the currency. And still, she wasn't done. She leaned forward suddenly, clutching the napkin tight in her fist. "I feel worthless," she whispered. "As if I've destroyed everything Mother gave us. As if I failed you." Those words broke me in ways I didn't expect. My sister, the girl I had sworn to protect, the woman who had carried our mother's memory in gold and laughter, was crumbling under shame that wasn't hers to carry. She was drowning in the illusion that she had failed us, when in truth, it was Arman who had shattered her. I wanted to shout, to tell her she was wrong, that none of this was her fault. But the words stuck in my chest, lodged behind a lump of grief and rage I couldn't dislodge. Instead, I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I paced to the window, staring out at the storm. The rain lashed the glass, streaks of water twisting down like veins. My reflection looked back at me, my face pale, my eyes dark with fury I barely recognized. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. For the first time in my life I felt powerless. Words, comfort, promises, none of it could undo what had been done. None of it could return the jewels or erase the humiliation she had endured. And that's when the realization struck, sharp as lightning. If I wanted to protect her now, it couldn't be with soft reassurances or empty vows. Arman had crossed into territory where words no longer mattered. To face him, I would have to become something else. Not just a brother, not just a man. Something colder, sharper, a force that could not be ignored. I turned back to her. She was staring down at the table, tears falling onto the napkin, staining it into a map of sorrow. I walked over, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "This is not your shame," I said finally, my voice low. "Do you hear me? This is not yours to carry." She nodded faintly, but her eyes remained clouded. I knew it would take more than words to lift that burden. So I stepped outside. The rain hit me immediately, soaking through my shirt, plastering my hair to my forehead. But I welcomed it. I needed the storm to cool the fire raging in my chest. I walked to the end of the street, fists trembling, heart pounding with a fury that made my vision blur. The empty chair at that table would haunt me forever. But it was also the turning point. That night, in the rain, I admitted the truth to myself. I could not protect her with comfort anymore. I had to protect her with action. Lightning split the sky, and in its flash I felt it, the seed of something dangerous rooting itself inside me. Revenge, yes, but not the wild, reckless kind. No, it would be deliberate, patient. A fire banked carefully until the moment it would consume everything he had built. I stood there in the storm, breathing hard, the taste of rain and salt on my lips, and I knew. Armin had taken her jewelry, her peace, her dignity. But in doing so, he had given me something too, a purpose sharp enough to cut through the darkest night, and I would not let it go. The morning after the storm, the world was eerily quiet. Streets still glistened from the night's downpour, puddles gathering in potholes like mirrors reflecting a fractured sky. My clothes from the night before still smelled of rain when I shoved them into the corner of my room. I couldn't sleep, and when I finally closed my eyes, all I saw was my sister's face at the dining table, pale, hollow, and bowed beneath a weight that wasn't hers. That image stayed with me, heavy as stone. I needed space, not just for myself, but for her too. If I was going to stand against Armin, I couldn't do it from inside the suffocating walls of our neighborhood, where every whisper carried and every silence felt like judgment. So I left. I packed light, a duffel bag with 2 shirts, a notebook, and my father's old watch, the one object I refused to part with, no matter how much it ticked like a reminder of time wasted. As I strapped it onto my wrist, I thought about how Armin had stolen hours, years, and dignity from my sister. This watch, though, this was proof that not all time could be gambled away. I told my sister I was going for work, and though she nodded, her eyes searched mine, as if she knew the truth ran deeper. I promised her I'd return stronger. She didn't ask questions. She simply whispered, "Don't disappear." The city faded behind me as the train rolled out, its windows streaked with the dried remains of last night's storm. I didn't know where I was going exactly, only that I needed distance, air, the kind of silence that lets wounds breathe. I ended up in a coastal town, small and unremarkable, where the sea stretched out in endless grey. I rented a tiny room above a mechanic's shop, the smell of oil and salt water forever tangled in the air. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in months, I felt the faintest pulse of control. The first nights were the hardest. Loneliness crept into the room like dampness, settling in the corners. I lay awake listening to the tick of my father's watch, each second a reminder that life was still moving, even if I wasn't. Sometimes I caught myself tracing the outline of the notebook I carried. Though blank, it called to me like an unopened wound. One night, unable to bear the silence, I walked down to the shore. The sea was violent, waves crashing against rocks like fists slamming a table. It reminded me of that storm, of the night I realized comfort would never be enough. I let the salt spray sting my skin, the roar of water drowning out the echo of Armin's betrayal. "Out there," I whispered into the wind, a vow only the waves would hear. "I will not let him win." Days blurred into weeks. I found odd jobs at the docks, hauling nets, unloading crates, the kind of labor that demanded more from the body than the mind. I welcomed the exhaustion, the ache in my muscles, the blisters that turned into calluses. Pain, at least, was honest. It stripped me down to the raw core of who I was, leaving no room for shame or doubt. At night, I wrote. At first, just fragments. A line about the rain, a sketch of the empty chair at my sister's table, a half-formed sentence about a necklace lost. The notebook filled slowly, each word an anchor pulling me deeper into my own clarity. I wrote not just about Armand's betrayal, but about myself. About the anger I carried, the guilt that I hadn't stopped him sooner, the quiet fear that I was becoming hollow too. Writing became survival. The notebook turned into my confessional, my battlefield, my mirror. But survival wasn't just about endurance. It was also about connection. There was an old fisherman at the docks named Raymond. His hands were scarred from decades of nets and hooks, his back bent, but his eyes held the calm of someone who had already weathered every storm life could throw. He didn't talk much, but one evening, when he saw me staring at the horizon long after the boats had gone in, he walked over and said, "The sea teaches you two things, patience and cruelty. If you learn the first, you survive the second." His words stayed with me. He became a quiet teacher, not in lectures but in gestures. He showed me how to tie knots that wouldn't slip, how to mend torn nets with steady hands. He taught me how to read the tide, how to know when to wait and when to act. Without realizing it, I began to apply those lessons to my own war brewing inside me. Armand was the tide, dangerous, unpredictable, but not invincible. If I learned patience, if I timed it right, I could turn his own cruelty against him. Slowly, survival shifted into something more. I started running in the mornings, the air sharp with salt. At first, I could barely make it a mile, lungs burning, legs heavy. But with each day, I pushed further. The rhythm of my footsteps became another kind of watch, another measure of time reclaimed. I also stopped avoiding my reflection. In the small cracked mirror above the sink in my rented room, I began to see changes. The shadows under my eyes faded. My frame grew leaner, harder. There was still anger in my gaze, but now it was tempered with focus. And then one day, as I strapped my father's watch on my wrist before heading to the docks, I realized something. The tick no longer sounded like loss. It sounded like preparation. The true turning point came one evening when I opened my notebook to a blank page, and instead of writing about pain, I wrote about possibility, about the future, about what justice might look like, not as some wild revenge, but as something sharp, undeniable, final. I wrote about my sister reclaiming her dignity, about the jewelry, not just as objects, but as symbols, memory, heritage, trust. I wrote about the storm and the empty chair, and how they would no longer be endings, but beginnings. When I finished, I closed the notebook and felt something shift inside me. Survival was no longer enough. It was time to begin the climb toward rebirth. I wasn't ready yet, not fully, but I knew the silence between storms was ending, and the next one would not break me. It would break him. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the ticking watch, I whispered, read to myself, "This is not survival anymore. This is the gathering of strength." And for the first time since Armand had betrayed her, I believed it. Rebirth rarely arrives with trumpets. It comes quietly, like dawn bleeding into the horizon while the world still sleeps. For me, it began one morning as I laced up my worn sneakers and caught my reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. My father's watch ticked on my wrist, its steady rhythm no longer a reminder of what I had lost, but of how much I had endured. My body was leaner now, harder, and my eyes, though lined with the remnants of sleepless nights, carried something they hadn't in years: resolve. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing. It started with the notebook. I flipped through the filled pages. Fragments of grief, sketches of storms, confessions too raw to share. And then I noticed patterns. Threads of Armand's deceit weaving through every entry. The way he borrowed money under false pretenses. The jewelry he gambled. The businesses he hinted at but never built. The friends who warned me but whom I dismissed. This wasn't just my pain written down. It was a ledger of his sins. I began to write differently, deliberately. Instead of half-formed sentences, I drafted detailed accounts, dates, names, conversations. I reconstructed arguments from memory, wrote down the exact way his voice shifted when he lied, the tremor in my sister's hand when she realized another heirloom was gone. My notebook was no longer a diary. It was becoming a weapon. Rehman, the old fisherman, noticed the change in me. "You're tying your knots tighter," he said one evening, watching me mend a torn net with careful fingers. "I can't afford loose ends," I replied. He didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he already knew. Or maybe he'd seen enough storms to recognize the way a man prepares before one breaks. His presence reminded me of patience, the lesson of the sea. Timing mattered. Rushing into a storm would only drown me. But if I gathered my strength, my proof, my purpose, I could steer it. My search for proof led me back into the world I had abandoned. I couldn't stay by the docks forever. If I wanted to confront Armand, I needed to understand the web he had spun. So I returned to the city in short bursts. I stayed in cheap motels on the edge of town, slipping into familiar streets like a shadow. I avoided my sister for now. I wasn't ready to face her with half-formed plans. Instead, I traced Armand's trail. At gambling dens hidden behind neon-lit bars, his name surfaced like oil on water. Some remembered him as the man who boasted of endless luck. Others muttered about unpaid debts and favors owed. In each whisper, I found a crack in his armor. I began collecting more than words. I spoke to a jeweler who admitted he'd bought one of my sister's pieces from Armand for half its worth. I tracked receipts, bank slips, loan records, scraps of paper people discarded, but which I gathered like broken glass, sharp and undeniable. Each item I folded carefully into my notebook. The weight of it grew, not just in pages but in purpose. Back at the coast, nights became sessions of strategy. I spread my notes across the small wooden table in my room, arranging them like puzzle pieces. The empty chair in front of me, once a symbol of absence, became my silent opponent. Sometimes I placed my father's watch in the center of the table, its ticking filling the room like a metronome. Time had always been Armand's ally. Every delay allowed him to sink deeper into deceit. But now, time was mine. With every second, I grew sharper, stronger. One evening, as I stared at the pile of evidence, I realized I no longer felt the same fire of anger that once consumed me. What I felt now was colder, steadier, a quiet flame that refused to die. Anger destroys, but resolve builds. I began to train myself in ways beyond the physical. I read about contracts, inheritance laws, debt settlements. Knowledge became another kind of weapon, one Armand wouldn't expect me to wield. Every new fact, every collected document, was like hammering another nail into the coffin he had built for himself. But rebirth wasn't only about power, it was also about reclaiming identity. For too long my life had revolved around my sister's suffering, Armand's betrayal, my own guilt. I had forgotten who I was outside of that orbit, so I forced myself to live in small ways. I cooked for myself instead of buying meals from the docks. I began sketching again, something I hadn't done since college. On blank pages I drew waves, hands, a chair by a window, a necklace that glimmered even in pencil strokes. These drawings weren't just distractions. They were pieces of me resurfacing, proof that I was more than just a witness to betrayal. The real test came unexpectedly. One evening, while visiting the city, I saw Armin. He was at a cafe, laughing too loudly, surrounded by men who looked at him with equal parts admiration and suspicion. He hadn't changed much, still polished, still arrogant. But I noticed something new in his eyes. A flicker of desperation, quickly masked by bravado. I didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, I watched from across the street, unseen. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I was no longer afraid of him. The man who once loomed like a storm cloud now looked small beneath the weight of the lies he carried. His laughter was hollow, his gestures forced. For the first time, I saw him not as a predator, but as prey who hadn't yet realized the trap closing around him. That night, back in my rented room, I opened my notebook and wrote one line across a fresh page. The storm belongs to me now. From that point, preparation turned into orchestration. I contacted the jeweler again, asking for a signed statement. I convinced one of Armin's old gambling partners to share details in exchange for settling a small debt he owed at T. He docks. Piece by piece, the puzzle tightened. Every page of my notebook was no longer just ink. It was rope. Rope I would use to bind him in his own deceit. I stopped thinking of the empty chair as a symbol of absence. Now it became a symbol of justice. One day Armin would sit across from me at a table, and the weight of truth would break him the way storms break careless sailors. And through it all, I carried my father's watch. Some nights I would take it off, place it beside the notebook, and listen to the twin sounds of ticking and silence. Time and truth, both on my side now. The jewelry, too, remained in my thoughts, not as objects to be reclaimed, but as symbols of something deeper: memory, dignity, inheritance. Armin thought he had gambled them away, reduced them to chips on a table, but I would show him they were never his to take. They lived in the stories, the proof, the will to fight. When the notebook was finally full, when the pages could hold no more ink or evidence, I closed it and felt the shift fully settle within me. This was no longer survival. This was power. And with that power, I was ready. The rebirth was complete. The storm was mine to summon. The confrontation was coming. The day of reckoning didn't come with thunder. It came with silence. I sat at the wooden table of my small rented room, the same table where for months I had spread my notes, my sketches, my fragments of grief and strategy. The chair across from me, the empty chair, was no longer empty. I had invited Armin here, and he had agreed. I looked at the notebook resting on the table, its spine cracked from use, its pages swollen with ink and evidence. Beside it lay my father's watch, ticking steadily like the heartbeat of the room. For months, I had prepared for this. Tonight, preparation would give way to confrontation. When the knock came, it was sharp, almost impatient. I opened the door, and there he stood, Armin, my sister's husband, my enemy. Time had etched itself into him since I last saw him up close. The tailored suit still clung to him like armor, but the fabric couldn't hide the hollowness beneath. His smile was too polished, his eyes darting too quickly as if measuring the room for exits. He carried himself like a man still trying to convince the world he was winning. "You wanted to see me," he said, brushing past me without waiting for an answer. His cologne filled the air, sharp and suffocating. He took the chair opposite mine. For the first time in years, the empty chair was filled. For a moment I just looked at him. He fidgeted under the weight of my silence, tapping his fingers against the wood. "Well, you dragged me here. What is this about?" I slid the notebook toward him, the sound of its cover scraping against the table breaking the stillness like a blade unsheathed. He smirked, masking the flicker of unease in his eyes. "What's this? A diary? You've been writing poetry about me?" "Not poetry," I said evenly. "Truth." I opened the notebook. The pages unfolded like a trial. Receipts, statements, transcripts of conversations, sketches of heirlooms that had vanished under his watch. His laughter died as his eyes darted from one page to another. "You've been busy," he muttered, his voice dropping lower. "While you gambled with what wasn't yours, yes, I've been busy," I said. "Busy gathering every thread of your deceit, every lie, every theft. It's all here." His mask cracked, his jaw tightened. "You think you can—" "I don't think," I cut him off. My voice was steady, stronger than I remembered it ever being around him. "I know. I know what you did with my sister's jewelry. I know which jeweler bought it. I have his statement. I know about the loans you took under her name, the debts you buried her in, the nights you told her you were working late while you sat in gambling dens." His silence was louder than any denial. I leaned forward, the foe, Arthur's watch catching the dim light between us. "Time is no longer on your side, Armin. The storm you created is here, and I am the one steering it." He laughed then, sharp, brittle. "What do you want? Money? A cut of what's left? You're just like the rest." I shook my head slowly. "No, I don't want your money. I want my sister's dignity restored. I want the truth to strip you of the mask you've worn for too long. And I want you to sit here, across from me, and feel what it means to finally lose." His hand twitched, as if to slam the notebook shut, but I placed my palm firmly on its cover. The weight of my years, my grief, my endurance, pressed through that touch. "This is no longer yours to silence," I said. He leaned back, trying to recover his composure. "Even if you take this to court, do you think she'll thank you? Do you think your sister will love you for airing her shame?" His words were knives, but I had already bled enough to be immune. "She already lost everything because of you," I replied. "There is no shame in truth. The only shame lies in your lies." The air thickened between us, heavy with years of betrayal. I could see sweat gathering at his temple, his polished confidence unraveling thread by thread. And then came the moment I had waited for, not his collapse, but mine. Because confrontation was never just about him, it was about me facing the man I had become in his shadow, the man who ran, who drowned himself in salt water, who let guilt chain him. I straightened in my chair. "Do you know what haunted me most these years? Not your theft, not even the way you broke my sister. It was the chair." His brow furrowed. "That chair," I gestured to the one he sat in. Empty, waiting, mocking me. Every night I stared at it, imagining you there. I filled it with silence, with storms, with grief. But now, I let the words hang. Now it's full, and I see you for what you are. Small, weak, prey. The words stung him. He shifted in the chair, as though its wooden frame had turned to iron shackles. I opened the notebook to its final page. In bold, deliberate ink I had written, "The storm belongs to me now." I turned it toward him. "This is the last thing I wrote, and it is the only truth that matters." For the first time, Armin had no words. Resolution didn't arrive in a single dramatic strike. It unfolded in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his eyes lowered, in the way his polished mask fell piece by piece. He wasn't the towering storm that once consumed my life. He was just a man, cornered by the truth he thought he had outrun. I gathered the notebook, slid it back to my side, and stood. "You'll return what you can. The rest you'll answer for, in court, to the debts you owe, to the people you've wronged. This isn't a negotiation. It's the end." He opened his mouth, but no sound came. I had already turned away. As I left the room, the weight on my shoulders lifted, not because I had destroyed him, but because I had reclaimed myself. The chair was no longer empty, the notebook no longer a wound, the watch no longer a reminder of loss. They were symbols of survival, of rebirth, of resolution. I walked into the night air, the salt breeze carrying the scent of the sea even this far from the docks. Above me the sky was clear, no storm clouds, no looming darkness, just stars. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from storms. I was walking beneath a sky I had earned. The storm belonged to me, and it was over.